If you pressed me to name a Canadian author, I could pretty easily come up with Margaret Atwood, Alice Munro, and usually Louise Penny. Although, embarrassingly, on the day I recorded this particular episode, I could not come up with Louise Penny. But no matter, it's fine. Let's call it lack of caffeine that day and not my extreme forgetfulness due to age and exhaustion levels. It's fine. Now, to be clear, those three writers I named are not exactly obscure writers. It's a bit like if someone asked me my favorite British band and I said the Beatles. Like, duh, try a little harder. You know? Mark Lefebvre and I have been friends for years, and you've heard him on this podcast many times. You've likely also heard us refer back to the frequent conversations we have offline about the books and writers and what we're reading. And it always kind of embarrasses me when he tells me about an author that he's really into, and I have no idea who it is. And he always says, "You wouldn't know, they're Canadian." Now, nobody can know every book on the planet, and I'm not going to pretend that's my goal. But these are my next-door neighbors, and I want to get to know them a little better by consuming more of their art. And asterisk, yeah, Mexico, I'm coming for your books next. Don't even worry, because I know even less about Mexican authors. Last week, after Mark and I talked about Terry Fallis's The Best Laid Plans, Mark very graciously agreed to hang out with me a little longer and talk more about the Canadian authors he's digging these days. Some of them are classics, some are brand new, some are traditional, and some are indie. Mark kept turning back to his bookshelf and grabbing titles to show me the cover, and then more ideas would pop into his head, and it was really fun to watch. And we did not even scratch the surface of his book knowledge. But it was a great introduction into the diverse array of Canadian literature and why Canadians write the best books ever. Hi, Mark. Welcome back to the Best Book Ever podcast.
Hey, Julie. It's great to talk books, hey?
It's oh, God. Okay.
See, I'm setting us up.
I know. All the Canadian lingo I know comes from Bob and Doug McKenzie, so I'm
You
sure.
hoser. You never read that book.
Is it going to be offensive if all I ever say is you hoser?
No, not at all. I mean, this is something that we definitely embrace. I love Bob and Doug McKenzie, like, it was, stereotypical beer drinking Canadians. It's a fun thing we still play off of.
Cool. Okay. So in our last episode, I was mentioning to you how embarrassingly little I know about Canadian authors. Margaret Atwood, most of us read in college.
Of course. But I'm sure you really, really adore Louise Penny.
Oh my God, Louise Penny.
She's Canadian.
Duh. I know.
She's so good, you didn't even realize she was Canadian.
But Louise Penny is very, very specifically Canadian. It's a very specific town.
Yes.
I'm really mad at myself.
A very French-Canadian name, Gamache.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And a lot of flavor for French Canada in those English books.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. That's embarrassing. So
I was surprised you never brought her up because I'm like, she's one of your favorite authors of all time.
I know. I have no words for that.
But that kind of defines a lot of Canadian success is that, let's be honest, Julie. So the population of Canada is about the same as the state that you live in, right? Mm. So when it comes to the entertainment, when it comes to writers and musicians and comedians and actors and et cetera, oftentimes we're not successful until we're successful in the U.S. Louise Penny is a perfect example.
So in the book that we talked about on our last episode, Best Laid Plans, there is a lot of mention of Robertson Davies.
Yes.
World of Wonders. He specifically name checks in that book. And then you said, when you said you wanted to talk about this book, you texted me that it reminded you of Robertson Davies. And I didn't know who that was. Yeah. So I guess my question is, how is Canadian literature taught to you Canadians? Is it a really central part of your education growing up?
Canadian literature is served up to us with a beautiful medley. It's like a buffet of British and American and Canadian. And oftentimes you have to look and go, oh, this is Canadian. So I'll give you an example. So Robertson Davies, usually in grade 9, at least, and I'm older, I'm in my mid-50s. So when I was in high school, we taught, and this is not the same for my son. I don't remember him ever doing Fifth Business by Robertson Davies, but that was a book we had to read in grade 9. I remember reading Generals Die in Bed, which was a Canadian novel of the war, World War II. And I do remember having to read some other Canadians. Oh my God, I'm drawing a blank now. Farley Mowat was one of the authors that we would read, classic literary Canadian. And of course, Margaret Atwood and Alice Munro. And those were some of the Canadians that we would read through school. But we would also be reading some of the other classics that you would probably find, To Kill a Mockingbird, and you've got Catcher in the Rye, and you've got The Great Gatsby, and stuff like that. So we're still exposed. It's not like we're only reading Canadian texts, but we're reading a medley of Canadian and American texts. So yes, there's Canadian books, but like a book that comes from the prairies is going to be different than one that comes from Ontario, different that comes from an East Coast writer, different that comes from French Canada, like Quebec, primarily French Canadian, or West Coast. You're going to get a whole bunch of different sensibilities because, again, we're quite a diverse nation. Never mind, speaking of diversity, what about the people who were here before us Commonwealth people came over and slaughtered them all and stole their land from them? Just to be honest about what the reality of the situation is that we're still trying to come to terms with and understand. But Indigenous writers, the First Nations people and the books that they've created. And we're now starting to pay more attention to some of those great texts and the great history of storytelling that is, moved into printed words where it was maybe potentially only oral. But now it's being captured. So
can you tell me some of those?
So, you know what? There's so many of them. I'm just going to call him Wob because I'll mispronounce his name. But Wob Rice. And I got to go see him do a talk at Sheridan College recently, The Moon of the Crusted Snow, which came out in 2018. And it's this beautiful sort of dystopian novel set in north of where I grew up in mid-northern Ontario, of this Indigenous community that's isolated, and you can only get there by snow machine in the winter. So it's that far away. Well, the world ends. We never find out what happened to the world, but the world ends, and they don't even know because they're not in contact with anyone. And when I saw him talking at Sheridan College, one of the things he said is, we already were used to having to travel and move all the time to keep staying away from the encroaching, the settlers who are coming in and inhabiting the land and destroying the natural resources that they were used to. So they had to keep moving and moving and moving. So they were already living in a dystopian world. And it's this beautiful perspective that I've never had of that world. And so Moon of the Crusted Snow came out, and it came out in 2018. I only just read it last year. Absolutely loved it. And then I was so thrilled to learn that Moon of the Crusted Leaves is coming out this October, and it is on my immediate to-buy list. And it also embraces the reality of living on a reserve and the culture and the leadership and the community, which is different and unique, but not all that different than living in a small remote community in mid-northern Ontario. It just has a different kind of culture and a way of speaking that I so recognize because, in the community where I grew up, I was like, oh my God, that is the dialogue that I understand. And it feels so natural for me to hear and go, oh yeah, that's from local First Nations. And this is Anishinaabe people from that area that I'm familiar with anyways.
Okay. Do you do that in Canada of the land that you're on? Are people recognizing that now when they say this is traditionally, like here it's Tongva land?
Yeah, we've been doing that for years, recognizing that. And now what I love about it, and it was just even at an event I was at in Waterloo on Saturday, not only do we recognize the land and we say that this is just the beginning of reconciliation because we've done some really horrible, nasty things. It's not just recognizing that the lands that we inhabit, the traditional lands, but that we still have a lot to do to reconcile. It's something that we constantly need to be aware of in a way to recognize, no, just saying this doesn't make things better. But I do respect that at least our government has started to take the steps. And I know it's not going to be something that's going to happen overnight. Of course it can't. How do you undo how many decades of trauma that you've inflicted upon a people?
Yeah, it's something we're wrestling with here. Very much.
Yeah, very much so. So, and again, we can't, Canadians cannot look down our nose at issues that are going on in the States because we're just as guilty of all of the things. So,
well, maybe not as guilty.
Well, we don't have as many guns to perpetuate some of the violence, but yeah.
Okay, hit me with some more then.
All right, so we were talking about Terry Fallis with the humor, Canadian humor, and I also discovered Rod Carley through a writers group from North Bay. It was a virtual writers group I went to talk to. Rod's done these humorous novels, A Matter of Will, a guy named William who works in the theater. And then Kinmount was this humorous novel by Rod about trying to put a Shakespearean play in a redneck small town Ontario community, which is absolutely fantastic. And then, of course, his most recent collection, Grin Reaping short stories, humorous short stories. And this is very Canadian. So it was a novel, a book, but it was a collection of linked short stories, and that's very Canadian. Alice Munro's Lives of Girls and Women, it's considered a novel, but it's linked short stories all in the same universe, and that's very, very Canadian. It's almost like, well, we don't have enough for a novel, but we're gonna tell you some stories, but it almost feels like that. Sitting around the kitchen table and you're hearing all these stories, but they're all from the same family and they're all interconnected, but there's not one story arc. Okay. And so that's what Grim Reaping is. Stephen Leacock, who is a Canadian humorist from, you would call it cottage country for a lot of rich Americans who would come up to Ontario. That's where the Leacock medal and the Leacock House and stuff like that. Okay. And one of my favorite Leacock stories is it's kind of this humorous story about this tragedy of this ship that was going on this excursion. And you're thinking it's going to be like the wreck of Edmund Fitzgerald, which is a Canadian tragedy you may know through Canadian music. Gordon Lightfoot, you probably never heard that song, but it's very, people know that the song, the Edmund Fitzgerald, which was a ship that went down in Lake Superior. Okay. Beautiful, haunting Canadian song. But so you're thinking about stories like that. You're thinking about the Titanic and Stephen Leacock's telling the story with the buildup that we're used to from Canadian, because, Titanic just off the shores of Newfoundland. Mm-hmm. And so you're reading the story, and then the tragedy is the ship goes down, and it's at a point in the lake near Barrie, Ontario, where it's only about 5 feet of water. So then you find out that this tragedy was kind of like, and they all got muddy walking back to the shore. But this is the Leacock Awards. Medal for Humor. Will Ferguson is another one who's won the Leacock Awards. Terry did win the Leacock Award as well. So there's just some really, really great books that get put on the list every year.
How would you define Canadian humor broadly?
I think Canadian humor, it seems to be very meta, because we recognize what we're laughing at ourselves a lot. And a lot of self-deprecation is part of Canadian humor. So there is a lot of that, and the way that humor twists things, right? But I think a lot of the humor is very much, let's poke fun at ourselves in certain ways so we can step back and look at ourselves and appreciate our own foibles. I'll be honest with you. We have some friends to the south that it's so easy to just point fingers. As Canadians, we're a weird blend of influence from the States, but influence from the UK. Mm-hmm. So we have this great medley of the two of them. So when you think about Canadian humor, like the Kids in the Hall, Lorne Michaels, SNL style, but it's almost like SNL meets Monty Python. So a lot of our humor is influenced greatly by American and British at the same time.
Yeah, the word I kept thinking as I was reading that Terry Fallis book was absurdist, because it seems to have this sort of, there's that lowbrow, the fart jokes, and when he falls in the pile of dog poop at the beginning of the book, and that sort of broad. But then there is the little hint of that sort of British dry wit to it. Yes. And it's all sort of combined into this. And I don't quite know how to describe it, but it does feel very specifically Canadian.
Yeah, absurdist is a perfect description. Yeah, there's a lot of that in our humor.
So to move on to a new genre now, you and your partner Liz recently hosted the Aurora Awards, which celebrates Canadian speculative fiction. Yeah. First of all, can you tell us what that means? What does speculative fiction mean?
So I like the term speculative fiction because it's all encompassing, because it's science fiction, fantasy, horror, and everything in between. Because if you say just science fiction, you're like, well, is it science fiction set in space and blah, blah, blah? Right. Is it whatever? Is it based on science? Is it fantasy based on Tolkien epic fantasy? Is it urban horror? Is it just hack and slash stuff? Or is it actually supernatural? So speculative it is so encompassing. Speculative obviously dystopian science fiction like The Handmaid's Tale, that is science fiction. It's better to call it speculative literature, isn't it? And so I love that because the premise of speculative fiction is what if? What if the robots rose and took over? Like, what if we continue the path we're going? Handmaid's Tale, right? What if monsters were real? What if a clown lived in the sewer and ate kids, right? What if a carnival that came to town brought magic with it and stuff like that?
So share some of the authors and works in the speculative area that you're excited about.
The winner was Kate Hartfield's. It's a book from Harper Voyager called The Embroidered Book, and that won Best Novel this year. And Best Novella was The Hollow Boys in the Dreamwriter Saga by Douglas Smith. And Best Novella was The Jade Setter of Zhen Lun by Fonda Lee, who's also another brilliant author who has won previous awards. So I'm going to spotlight Julie Trineda. So she is an Aurora winner from the past. Julie Trineda, science fiction writer. She also writes fantasy as well. And she's got about probably 10, 12 books. This one's a special one, Changing Vision. And this is because Julie sent me the proofs, the unbound proofs early on galleys before the book was published. She said, just because you're a bookseller I've really admired and you're a writer, she created a Captain Rudy Lefebvre, who is meant to be a minor character in the book as a nod to me. He ends up becoming the main bad guy in the book. And she's like, listen, if you want me to take the name out, I will. And I still have the marked up manuscript, Captain Rudy Lefebvre. And ironically, so when she sent this to me, I had hair, but he was a bald captain of a starship. And I was like, that's so cool. He made me a captain. And so I don't care if I'm a bad guy. Anyway, so that's
how cool to have any character in a novel named after you, but it'd be a blast to have a villain named after you. That's very
It was
cool.
so fun. It was so fun. So you got that. Another writer, a good friend of mine, Robert J. Sawyer. So this is a book, and he writes a lot of near real time. You may, if you've ever seen the ABC TV series Flash Forward, it was based on one of his novels, which the premise was everyone blacks out for about 2 minutes around the Earth at the exact same time because of something that happened. Hadron Collider was running, and everyone just blacked out and collapsed for 2 minutes. But they had a flash forward in the novel. Flash forward, they see 2 minutes of time, 30 minutes in the future. In the TV series, they went 6 months into the future. The premise is, if you knew the future, could you change it? And so the cool thing about the premise is the main character in the TV series adaptation of Flash Forward, which was Joseph Fiennes, who was the main character. He's an FBI agent, and he sees himself working on this weird thing, like in the office late at night, and someone breaks in and they're coming to kill him. That was what he saw in his flash forward. His wife sees herself in bed and her partner is coming around the corner, and she says, hey, honey. And it's not her husband, it's some other man. So that 6 months from now, she's not going to be with her husband. And the cop's partner doesn't see anything because there's some people who don't see anything. It was just blackness. So they wonder, am I dead? Does that mean I'm dead? So that's the premise of Flash Forward.
Oh, that's
so that's Robert's kind of science fiction. So Rollback is a book I always hand sold in bookstores to people who said they don't read science fiction, because Rollback, the premise of that is, if you like The Time Traveler's Wife, it's a love story in many ways with speculative elements to it, you may enjoy Rollback. And the premise is, this woman is a scientist and she's in her 80s, and she was one of the first people who actually communicated and deciphered an alien transmission via CERN, CERN. And so she sent it off, and they just got the transmission back 30, 40 years later, and she's in her 80s. And they want her to still be there in another 30 years because she's the best person to do the translation and continue this ongoing communication with the alien species. But she's in her 80s. She's married happily. There's an experimental procedure that costs billions of dollars. So very few people can get it, except the people who shoot themselves into space and stuff like that. Those people, right? They can get it done. It's called a rollback. It's a combination of operations, genetically engineered things that you consume and procedures that they run on you that create a rollback that bring you back to about the physical age of 25. She refuses to do it unless they also give one to her husband. So it's a big deal because it costs billions of dollars. She's like, I'm not doing it unless you do my husband. They're like, okay, we'll do you and your husband. It works for him, but just like sometimes things don't take and don't work. He becomes 25. She's still in her 80s, and they're really in love. But he's suddenly a 25-year-old who doesn't want to just play chess or Scrabble. He wants to go rollerblading and do things that someone in their 20s can do. How do they deal with this? They've been together 60 years. And suddenly he's 25 again and she's still in her 80s. How do they navigate that? And that's the beauty, in my mind, of great science fiction, because it asks you those questions. You've got authors like Nalo Hopkinson. She's also a brilliant literary science fiction writer. This is The Salt Roads, but Brown Girl in the Ring was her first novel, and it's still my favorite of hers.
That is an insane cover.
Yeah, just beautiful artwork as well, right? But again, it brings a different sort of diversity to Canadian, right? Nalo is Canadian, but also with a different heritage as well. So she brings a lot of that sort of Caribbean style art and literature and experience to her writing, which is just absolutely amazing. You've got, oh my God, James Allen Gardner, humorous science fiction. All those explosions were someone else's fault, which is set here in Waterloo, Ontario. And it's about university students who have superpowers. And James's titles of short stories and novels are just the best. Monsters are real, so are heroes. But this is because it's set locally, and it's just such a fun madcap adventure. Sean Costello, horror author, a mentor of mine, Eden's Eyes, woman who receives the transplant of eyes from a serial killer, but she starts having visions of some of the things. That was his first book that came out in the 90s. Ado Van Belkome's Death Drives a Semi, which is my version of Ray Bradbury's The October Country. Just great macabre short stories. Andrew Piper, The Demonologist, again, Andrew Piper, thriller, but with just that little bit of speculative, little bit of are there demons? Do they exist? Those are just some of the speculative books. Oh my God, I could keep going, but there's just so many. And that's just the tip of the iceberg from the science fiction, fantasy, and horror authors that we have here in Canada. See, you get me going, Julie.
I know. Okay. Well, hit me with what's next. What genre are we doing next?
I want to move into thrillers. I mentioned Nicole Bart, The Long Way Home, but she's Canadian-American. Samantha M. Bailey, domestic thrillers. And have you read any of her books yet?
She's coming on the podcast in January.
Oh my God, you're going to have such a great talk.
I'm really
talking
excited.
to Sam. Oh my God, she's so absolutely brilliant thrillers. Speaking of great thrillers, you've got Giles Blunt, who writes very much, if you like Louise Penny, it's very much the Northern detective. And so Giles Blunt, I remember being touted as sort of a Canadian Michael Connelly. I'm a huge Michael Connelly fan, one of my favorite writers of all time. I love his novels as well. And again, they're set in sort of near North Bay, Ontario. So they're very North-esque, and they have that character and the flavor. Linwood Barclay's one of those big authors he's got about 20 books out now, and they're all phenomenal thrillers. Requiem Athena, I just finished reading from his Ray Wyatt series. These are thrillers: Into the Fire, The Hollow Place, and Requiem. So I've read Into the Fire and The Hollow Place, and then book 3. And this is a journalist who ends up solving some mysteries, but there's his dead son, he believes, is actually still alive, because there's evidence that he may have thought they burned up in a fire, but there's evidence that he may still be alive. So there's this continuing storyline in these.
So those have to be read in order then, since there's
they do.
ongoing.
You've got, oh my God, Kelly Armstrong. A lot of Michael Andrews in The Canadian Werewolf were inspired by the Women of the Otherworld series by Kelly Armstrong, which started off with Bitten and Stolen. But she also has this amazing thriller series. And the thriller series is Rockton, City of the Lost. And one of the cool things is the premise for this is she heard a stat that said, every day in America, enough people disappear to populate a small town.
What?
So she's like, wonder where that town would be. I wonder why they disappeared. And so it is a town of people populated only by people who've disappeared. And it's like in the middle of northern whatever in Rockton. And so that was a standalone novel, Penguin Random House published initially. And then she's got 6 books in that series since then. I think I've only read 3 so far, but absolute phenomenal thrillers. Kelly's just releasing, or has just released, I can't remember if it's out yet or it just hasn't come out yet, but her very first horror novel. And she's written for me. She's written short horror for me, for an anthology that I edited years ago. You've got Claire Cameron, The Line Painter. Line Painter was a thriller of a woman who gets trapped on a highway in the middle of northern Ontario in the middle of the night and gets picked up by the line painter who's painting lines on the highway. And he's not a nice guy. And then The Bear. The Bear is about these 2 kids that get trapped in northern Ontario. The parents get eaten by a bear, and they're trapped under the canoe as the bear is consuming their parents.
Oh my God.
And it's the thriller of their survival. And she's got The Last Neanderthal, which I haven't read yet, but that's her latest novel. Claire Cameron is a brilliant author as well.
Wait, that bear one, is that an adult book?
Oh, it's an adult book. Oh my God, it is an adult book. Yeah.
Because the cover, I could see one of my kids picking up that cover. It's sort of
it is terrifying. It is absolutely terrifying. Okay. Oh my God, and Catherine Marie Buchanan, author of The Painted Girls and The Day Niagara Falls Stood Still. I haven't even talked about Julianne McLean, The Color of Heaven. About her. Women's fiction with, very romance oriented. This is the first book in that series. Oh my God. And she originally released it as E.W. Mitchell, but then Julianne McLean's a very successful East Coast author from Canada, self-published and traditionally published, and absolutely phenomenal writer. You've got my friend Chris Humphreys, Chasing the Wind. This is a Penguin Random House Canada book, but he's got another one. This is like a thriller set during World War II. Someday I'll Find You.
These covers are the ones that really draw me in.
Someday I'll Find You is based on his parents' story about their involvement in war, like loosely based on his parents, but it's been burning up the bestseller charts here in Canada. And so he just released the international edition because it's only available in Canada through Penguin Random House Canada, but I helped them release the international edition because I'm like, your fans in the US can't even buy your book right now. I'm sure you've heard of, and you probably have heard of this under a different title. Oh my God, Lawrence Hill, absolutely brilliant. And here in Canada, it's called The Book of Negroes. And in the States, the publisher, and this is HarperCollins, they went with Somebody Knows My Name. Only because of the use of the word Negroes. And Lawrence, I met when he was a writer in residence at University of McMaster. And that's when I got to know him. And he is an absolute brilliant writer. Yeah. Literary great, but also one of the nicest, kindest people you'll ever meet. There's so many great Canadian authors. Scott Overton, Canadian science fiction writer from where I grew up. And you may know Scott because he's the voice of Michael Andrews for the Canadian Werewolf books. But
of course,
Scott, his first novel, Dead Air, and Scott's a retired radio personality, is a phenomenal thriller about a radio personality who kind of pisses off the wrong person who comes after him. It's really, really good. And the rest of his novels are all science fiction, and they're great novels. But wow, such a great talent. I count many of these authors among my friends, so I'm lucky in those regards as well. But I mean, this is just the tip of the Canadian iceberg of when it comes to great books that you can read from Canadian authors.
What are you noticing in new and up-and-coming Canadian literature? Do you feel like it's changing? How do you feel like it's evolving?
What I'm seeing, because I don't read just one genre, is what I love about what I'm seeing in Canadian literature is the explosion of Canadians into all the different genres. There are great Canadian romance authors. There are great Canadian literary authors. There are great Canadian spec fiction authors. There are great Canadian thriller authors. There are great Canadian comedic authors. There's so many amazing types of writers. So it regardless of what genre you prefer to read, there is probably a Canadian author that's written something that you're just going to love. And I know you deeply, deeply love, Louise Penny. And any, like the minute she puts a book out, you're there first in line to buy it, right?
Yes, always.
I'm the same thing with Terry Fallis, right? Terry Fallis releases a book. Sean Costello releases a book. Robert J. Sawyer releases a book. Linwood Barclay, the minute he puts out a book, I have to buy it. That's the beauty is I can read nothing but Canadian authors for the rest of my life. I won't because I love to, read more authors, but I could read nothing but Canadian authors for the rest of my life and never get to the end of my to-read list.
Starting to feel like that because my list is expanding as we go here. This has been amazing. My TBR list is now gigantic, as always, when I talk to you.
And it's very apologetic now, too.
Yes, that's right.
Smells a little bit like maple syrup and...
Listen, let me tell you my favorite Canadian story is my Canadian cousins were in California and we had a kid's birthday party for a few of the cousins and they had a little petting zoo. And at the time, his daughter was 2 years old and she kicked one of the goats. because she was a baby and babies just do things.
Mm-hmm.
And he picked her up and he moved her away and he said, we don't kick goats. And I am not kidding you. He turned around to the goat and he goes, sorry, goat.
You can tell. Oh, that's my Canadian friend over there.
Yes. Very good. All right, Mark. Well, I want to thank you for joining me again. And this has been so much fun. And as always, I hope you'll come back whenever you have more Canadian or other authors to tell me about.
Love to. Thanks, Julie.
Bookworms, I would love to hear your suggestions for more Canadian literature. Who else do you recommend? Let me know over on Instagram at Best Book Ever Podcast. Also, if you have suggestions for other country deep dives, let me know. I would love to make this a regular feature. Links to everything we discussed today are available in the show notes. This episode was produced by Emily Zumchak of theauthorelf.com. If you enjoyed our work, please leave a review wherever you're listening. If you want to learn more about my weekly guests, as well as get a little peek into what I'm reading and listening to in my free time, subscribe to my weekly pod newsletter at bestbookeverpodcast.substack.com. The newsletter's free, but once you get there, you'll see a few different paid options if you want to help me keep the candles burning over here in my reading cave. Thanks for joining me today. And as always, I will see you at the library.